The night of December 9th, 2001, was calm, the chill of winter creeping into the quiet streets of Durham, North Carolina. The upscale Forest Hills neighborhood, where grand homes sat tucked behind perfectly manicured lawns, was peaceful, its residents long since settled in for the night. Yet in the darkness, a single house was stirring. At 2:40 a.m., the peace was shattered by a 911 call. "Please. You've got to send someone now." The man's voice was shaking, his words rushed, almost incoherent. "My wife. She's had an accident. She fell down the stairs." The dispatcher tried to calm him, her questions precise, but he could barely hold it together. "She's still breathing." I think he stammered. "There's so much blood. Oh God, please hurry." That man was Michael Peterson, a well-known local author, and the home he was calling from, a sprawling 3-story mansion, was now the site of an unimaginable tragedy. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived, their vehicles casting blue and red flashes across the quiet neighborhood. As they stepped inside the large home, they were met with a sight far worse than they had anticipated. At the base of the staircase, Kathleen Peterson lay motionless, her body twisted in a pool of blood. It spread thickly around her head, staining the cream-colored carpet a deep crimson. The walls along the staircase were streaked with splatters of blood, a jarring contrast against the white paint. The sheer amount of it sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned responders. Michael was nearby, his hands trembling, his face pale with shock. "She just fell," he murmured, his voice hollow, as though he were struggling to grasp the reality of the scene in front of him. "She fell. I don't know what happened." The paramedics rushed to Kathleen's side, checking for any sign of life. But it was too late. Kathleen Peterson, beloved wife and mother, was gone. As the paramedics quietly worked, trying to make sense of the scene, whispers began to circulate among the responders. The amount of blood, the unusual lacerations on her scalp. Could this really have been just a fall? From the outside looking in, Michael and Kathleen Peterson were the embodiment of success, a power couple living a charmed life in the affluent Forest Hills neighborhood of Durham, North Carolina. Their sprawling mansion stood as a symbol of everything they had achieved, a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the trappings of their shared accomplishments. Friends who visited the Petersons marveled at the easy affection between them. The way Michael could make Kathleen laugh with a quick-witted remark, and how Kathleen seemed to glow in his presence. Together they presented the image of a couple who had it all. Kathleen Peterson had been a trailblazer. A sharp, driven woman with a quick mind, she had risen through the ranks of corporate America to become a high-powered executive at Nortel Networks, a telecommunications giant. She was well respected by her colleagues, admired for her ability to navigate the male-dominated world of business with grace and strength. Known for her work ethic and ability to tackle challenges head-on, Kathleen had built a life that many aspired to, filled with professional achievement and personal fulfillment. To her friends and family, Kathleen was the rock who held everyone together, the vibrant matriarch who threw lively parties and brought people into her orbit. Michael, on the other hand, had carved out a different kind of career. He was a man of many talents, having served in the Marine Corps and then finding success as a novelist. His works, often gripping war novels, reflected a deep understanding of conflict and human emotion. With titles like A Time of War and The Immortal Dragon, Michael's novels earned him respect and accolades from the literary community, and he was well known for his sharp intellect and charisma. In the small but close social circles of Durham, Michael Peterson was something of a local celebrity. He was often the center of attention at dinner parties, holding court with captivating stories from his time in Vietnam or anecdotes about the writing life. He had a certain charm, a way of making people feel at ease in his presence. For those who knew him, Michael was a man of strong opinions, sharp humor, and immense creativity. Together, the Petersons' lives were marked by a blend of professional success and personal devotion. Their love story began like many second marriages, a chance meeting that bloomed into something unexpected. Kathleen had been divorced, with a daughter, Caitlin, from her previous marriage, and Michael had his own history: 2 sons, Todd and Clayton, and 2 adopted daughters, Margaret and Martha Ratliff, whom he had taken in after their mother, who was a close friend of Michael's who died under tragic circumstances. Their blended family had its challenges, like any, but those who knew them best saw the Petersons as deeply committed to each other and their children. Kathleen, in particular, was a doting mother, attending Caitlin's college events and throwing herself into the lives of her stepchildren with the same enthusiasm she brought to her career. Their home was a hub of activity. Kathleen was known for her love of hosting friends and family, and their house was always filled with laughter, wine, and conversation that carried late into the night. The Petersons threw dinner parties that were the talk of Durham's social scene. Kathleen had a sharp mind, and she and Michael were often surrounded by intellectuals, writers and business people drawn to their energy, their intellect, and their seemingly unshakable bond. To those on the outside, the Petersons had built a life that appeared enviable in every way. They had money, a beautiful home, a loving family, and a vibrant social life. In a town like Durham, where reputation meant everything, the Petersons stood near the top of the social ladder, respected and admired. Yet, as the hours passed after that fateful night, the image of Michael and Kathleen as the perfect couple began to crack. The news of Kathleen's death spread quickly, sending shockwaves through Durham. People couldn't believe it. Kathleen, the lively, successful woman who seemed to have everything, was gone just like that. A fall down the stairs, they were told. A tragic accident. In those early hours and days, most of the couple's friends and acquaintances could hardly fathom anything more sinister. Michael had always been devoted to Kathleen, and their marriage, despite its complexities, had always appeared solid. He was grieving, heartbroken, they were sure. The Michael they knew couldn't possibly have had anything to do with his wife's death. What was really going on behind the doors of 1810 Cedar Street? Was the perfect couple really as perfect as they seemed? The morning after Kathleen Peterson's tragic death, the calm of Cedar Street was quickly replaced by the bustle of an unfolding investigation. The police had cordoned off the Peterson mansion, yellow crime scene tape flapping in the cold December breeze. The home, once filled with the comforts of family life, now stood as a grim crime scene, its ornate staircase at the center of it all. As investigators began their work, something about the scene didn't sit right. The sheer amount of blood was disturbing, far more than anyone would expect from a typical fall down the stairs. Blood coated the walls of the stairwell in thick streaks, as though something violent had occurred. It splattered across several steps and smeared at strange angles, almost as if someone had tried to move or rise again and again. And Kathleen herself, lying in a pool of dark red, had suffered injuries that seemed far too extensive for a simple accident. But the most unsettling part of it all, the look on the faces of the first responders as they left the house, faces that betrayed a shared, silent suspicion. What they had seen didn't feel right. And as crime scene specialists worked through the details, that creeping doubt began to harden into something more substantial. Inside the mansion, the forensic team meticulously photographed every inch of the staircase, carefully documenting the blood patterns that stood out starkly against the otherwise pristine walls. Blood spatter analysis was critical here. Falls typically produce minimal blood, a small cut perhaps, but not this, a macabre display of crimson stains that covered large swaths of the staircase. The medical examiner arrived shortly after the initial investigation began, taking in the scene before kneeling beside Kathleen's body. From the start, her injuries told a troubling story. Kathleen's head bore several deep lacerations, not the kind one might expect from tumbling down a set of stairs. These were jagged, gaping wounds, open and severe, almost as though something had struck her repeatedly. The cuts weren't clean, and there were no obvious objects nearby that could explain them. As the medical examiner carefully inspected Kathleen's body, doubts surfaced about how such injuries could result from a simple fall. A single slip might cause a bump or bruise, even a broken bone, but Kathleen's injuries went far beyond that. The lacerations on her scalp, coupled with the odd angles of the blood spatter, raised the possibility that something or someone else had caused this. The examiner ran a hand over Kathleen's battered scalp, noting the pattern of wounds. There were multiple lacerations, at least 3, possibly 4. Too many for a fall. Her hands showed no significant bruising or broken nails, no defensive wounds, as might be expected if she had tried to catch herself. It was as if she had gone down the stairs without any attempt to stop her fall, unconscious or incapacitated. This was no ordinary accident. Meanwhile, outside the mansion, Michael Peterson stood on the front lawn, huddled in a thick jacket, his face pale. Neighbors and friends, hearing the news of Kathleen's sudden death, had already begun to gather, their faces etched with shock and confusion. For now Michael's grief appeared genuine, his shock at losing his wife clear to everyone around him. He answered questions haltingly, still visibly shaken, as officers moved in and out of his home, gathering evidence and piecing together a picture of what had happened the night before. "Do you remember how much you drank last night?" one officer asked. Michael shook his head. "We had wine, maybe 2-3 glasses each. I don't know. I stayed outside smoking after she went in. I didn't hear anything. I don't understand." There was no aggression in his answers, no defensiveness, just the bewildered response of a man who seemed genuinely stunned by the tragedy that had unfolded in his home. But inside the house, the scene that was emerging painted a much darker picture. Back inside, the lead detectives began to question their own initial assumptions. They walked through the crime scene, retracing the steps Kathleen might have taken on her way to bed that night. The staircase, wide and elegantly designed, didn't seem like the kind of place someone could easily slip and fall. There were no tripping hazards, no objects she might have stumbled over, no sign of a struggle that might explain the excessive injuries she sustained. If she had simply fallen, why was the blood spread over such a large area? And then there was the blow poke. Initially thought to be missing, the fireplace tool had been a decorative item in the Peterson home for years. Michael said it had been misplaced months before Kathleen's death. But its absence became notable as detectives scoured the house, looking for an object that might explain the injuries to Kathleen's head. Could a blow poke, long, heavy, and sturdy, have been the instrument used? Or was this just a coincidence? Hours later, as Kathleen's body was transported to the medical examiner's office for a full autopsy, investigators gathered in a quiet room to discuss their findings so far. The consensus was grim. Kathleen's injuries were not consistent with a fall. The lacerations were too deep, the blood patterns too erratic. Something far more violent had occurred in the Peterson home that night, something that didn't align with Michael's version of events. Yet there was no definitive proof, no witness, no weapon, no confession, just a growing sense of suspicion. But Michael Peterson's calm composure, which had been so evident in the early hours of the investigation, was now raising quiet concerns. His answers were too vague, his memory too foggy. He showed shock, but little visible grief. Officers noted how quickly he shifted between confusion and control, how his words lacked the raw emotion they had seen in other grieving spouses. Something about his demeanor felt off. As dusk fell over Durham that evening, investigators returned to the house to confront Michael. "Mr. Peterson," the lead detective said, his voice steady but firm, "we've reviewed the scene and we've spoken to the medical examiner. I think it's important you know that we're not convinced this was an accident." The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. Michael blinked, his expression frozen for a moment, as if he hadn't fully processed what had just been said. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice flat. "She fell. That's what happened. She fell." But the detectives didn't budge. The investigation was moving in a different direction now, and Michael Peterson was no longer just a grieving husband. He was the center of their growing suspicion. As investigators continued to probe into Kathleen Peterson's death, the image of the grieving husband they had initially encountered began to show cracks. In those early days, Michael Peterson had been cooperative, answering questions, albeit somewhat vaguely, about the events leading up to his wife's death. Investigators began digging deeper, and it wasn't long before they uncovered a secret that would turn the case upside down. Behind the polished facade of a devoted husband, accomplished writer and local celebrity, Michael Peterson had been leading a double life. The revelation came quietly at first, small pieces of information gathered from his computer, phone records, and interviews with acquaintances. Michael had been seeking out male companionship online, engaging in extramarital affairs with men over the course of several years. The details were explicit, found in emails and messages exchanged with various partners, some of whom lived locally, others from farther away. For a man who was well known and respected in his community, this discovery was nothing short of shocking. The investigators, who had initially focused on the forensic evidence surrounding Kathleen's death, were now forced to consider a new, unsettling possibility. Was Michael's secret life the key to understanding what had really happened on that cold December night? For everyone who knew the Petersons, the news hit like a thunderbolt. Kathleen's family, in particular, was devastated. They had seen the couple as deeply in love, solid in their marriage. Kathleen had never once hinted that her husband might be unfaithful. Could it be that she didn't know? Or perhaps worse, had she known all along and chosen to stay silent, holding together the facade of their seemingly perfect life? Michael's friends, too, were floored by the discovery. He had always presented himself as a charming intellectual, outspoken, yes, but grounded. His persona, as far as anyone could tell, was one of a devoted husband, a family man who had weathered life's storms with resilience and wit. To those who had been closest to him, the idea that Michael had been living a secret life felt incomprehensible. But the evidence was there, undeniable. Had Kathleen found out about Michael's affairs? If she had, it could have led to confrontation, something far more heated than the quiet, pleasant evening Michael had described to the police. Perhaps she had confronted him that night, furious at his betrayal, demanding answers, and maybe, just maybe, things had spiraled out of control. For the investigators, this revelation changed the entire tone of the case. Initially, they had considered Michael a man struck by tragedy, someone who might be guilty of hiding details out of shock or confusion. Now they had to ask a darker question: was Michael's secret life not just an indiscretion, but a motive for murder? The medical examiner's report had already cast serious doubt on Michael's story. The wounds Kathleen had suffered were not consistent with a fall, and the excessive amount of blood in the stairwell indicated a far more violent event than Michael had described. But there had been no obvious motive until now. The discovery of his infidelity, particularly his affairs with men, provided the investigators with a new lens through which to view the crime. It wasn't just the shock of extramarital affairs that raised eyebrows, it was the fact that Michael had kept this part of himself hidden for so long. To Kathleen's family and their friends, Michael had always been a devoted husband. If she had uncovered this secret, how would she have reacted? Could it have led to a violent confrontation that ended in tragedy? The police began questioning Michael again, but this time their tone had shifted. The easy, almost sympathetic exchanges from earlier in the investigation were gone, replaced with harder, sharper questions. Detectives wanted to know more about his relationships, his time online, and how long this secret had been kept from Kathleen. At first, Michael maintained his composure. He was used to answering tough questions, accustomed to handling scrutiny with charm and wit. But this was different. The questions felt invasive, personal. And as they pressed him about his extramarital affairs, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. "Did Kathleen know?" one detective asked bluntly. "Did she ever find out?" Michael's face remained stoic, but there was a slight hesitation before he answered. "No," he said finally, his voice low. "She didn't know." But the detectives weren't convinced. They kept pushing, probing for more details, for any sign that Michael might crack under the weight of his secrets. "Did you argue that night? Was there a fight?" "No," Michael repeated, his voice growing firmer, almost defiant. "We didn't argue. She didn't know." As the media got wind of the new developments, the public's perception of Michael began to shift dramatically. The story of a tragic accident was now being overshadowed by the sensational revelations of infidelity and lies. Local headlines screamed about Michael's secret life, and whispers about his possible guilt spread through Durham. People who had once supported him, who had attended his parties and shared dinner at his table, began to question everything they thought they knew. Kathleen's family, devastated by her sudden death, had initially been focused on grieving. But now, with these new revelations, they couldn't help but wonder if they had been blind to something far darker. Had Kathleen confided in anyone about her suspicions? Had she known more than she let on? As investigators pieced together the fragments of Michael's double life, they could only speculate about the events leading up to Kathleen's death. What they knew for certain was that the man standing before them was not who he seemed. His carefully constructed public image had been torn apart by the reality of his secret affairs, and with it came the growing suspicion that Kathleen's death was no accident. The investigation was no longer just about the blood on the stairs. Now it was about trust, betrayal, and the possibility that Michael Peterson's secrets had led to murder. By the time the trial of Michael Peterson officially began, the case had become a media circus gripping not just Durham, North Carolina, but the entire nation. What had started as a seemingly tragic accident had now evolved into a highly publicized murder trial, with headlines fixating on the darkest corners of Michael's double life. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, their cameras focused on the man who had once been a respected novelist and family man, but was now charged with the brutal murder of his wife, Kathleen Peterson. The prosecution wasted no time setting the stage for their narrative. Kathleen's death, they argued, was no accident. District Attorney Hardin stood before the jury, painting a picture of a couple whose seemingly perfect marriage had unraveled in the most violent way possible. He described how Kathleen, an intelligent and driven woman, had been deceived by her husband for years. The discovery of Michael's affairs, specifically his relationships with men, had shattered her world, leading to a confrontation on the night of her death. Hardin leaned heavily on the physical evidence, particularly the disturbing amount of blood found at the crime scene. Blood spatter experts were called to testify, describing in excruciating detail how the patterns of blood on the walls and floor suggested a violent struggle rather than a fall. They pointed to the multiple lacerations on Kathleen's scalp wounds they believed could not have been caused by a simple tumble down the stairs. The injuries were far too severe, too numerous to align with Michael's story of an accidental fall. Central to the prosecution's case was the blow poke, a long, slender fireplace tool that had been missing from the Peterson household. According to Hardin, the blow poke had been used as the murder weapon, its heavy, blunt end used to strike Kathleen repeatedly. In dramatic fashion, the prosecution presented the blow poke as the critical missing piece of the puzzle. It had been a fixture in the Peterson home for years, a common household object that had mysteriously vanished right around the time of Kathleen's death. This, Hardin said to the jury, was no accident. This was a brutal, premeditated act of violence. To drive home the theory, the prosecution brought in bloodstain pattern experts, forensic analysts, and even Kathleen's friends and family to testify to her character and her marriage. They spoke about her strength, her resilience, and her devotion to her family. Kathleen had never been someone to back down from a challenge. If she had discovered Michael's secret life, it was not in her nature to ignore it. She would have confronted him, and that, the prosecution argued, had been her fatal mistake. The prosecution's star witnesses were crucial to establishing motive. They outlined Michael's financial struggles and the looming strain of Kathleen's high-powered job at Nortel, where layoffs were imminent. But it was Michael's secret life, the relationships with men, that had the courtroom buzzing. Hardin argued that Kathleen, on the night of her death, had discovered the truth about Michael's affairs, which led to a bitter argument. In a desperate moment, fueled by rage and fear of exposure, Michael had attacked her. Michael Peterson had everything to lose, Hardin emphasized. A public scandal, the destruction of his family, the end of his career, and Kathleen was the only one standing in his way. The prosecution's strategy was clear: expose Michael Peterson not just as a man capable of lying to his wife, but as someone capable of killing her to protect his secrets. While the prosecution painted Michael as a deceptive man with a hidden life, the defense, attorney David Rudolph, aimed to dismantle that narrative piece by piece. His strategy was to focus on the inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence and to cast doubt on their theory of what happened that night. Rudolph's cross-examination of the bloodstain experts was precise and brutal. He challenged their conclusions, pointing out that blood spatter analysis was as much art as science, a subjective field open to interpretation. He questioned whether the wounds on Kathleen's head truly matched the blows of a blow poke, or whether they could have been caused by a fall down the stairs, especially one exacerbated by alcohol. Kathleen had been drinking that night, a fact that Rudolph highlighted repeatedly, suggesting that her intoxicated state made her more likely to stumble, especially on a narrow, dimly lit staircase. But Rudolph's boldest move came when he confronted the prosecution's theory about the blow poke. In a dramatic moment, he revealed that the missing blow poke had been found dusty and untouched in the Petersons' garage. He argued that it had never been used in the murder at all, and that the prosecution had constructed an entire theory around an object that played no part in Kathleen's death. The courtroom was stunned. If the blow poke wasn't the murder weapon, Rudolph argued, then what was? Rudolph also attacked the prosecution's portrayal of Michael's secret life. Yes, he admitted, Michael had engaged in extramarital affairs, but that didn't make him a murderer. He argued that Michael's relationships with men were consensual and discreet, and there was no evidence that Kathleen had ever discovered them. Rudolph suggested that the prosecution was relying on salacious details to sway the jury emotionally, rather than focusing on the facts of the case. Kathleen Peterson was a strong, intelligent woman, Rudolph told the jury, his voice measured and calm. If she had known about Michael's affairs, don't you think she would have confronted him long before that night? Would she really stay silent for so long, only to explode in a fit of rage at that moment? This doesn't make sense. Rudolph's defense strategy was clear: cast doubt on the forensic evidence, discredit the blow-poke theory, and dismantle the notion that Michael's infidelity was enough to drive him to murder. To him, this was a case of an unfortunate accident, a tragic fall down the stairs, not a premeditated act of violence. As the trial of Michael Peterson pressed on, the prosecution introduced what they believed would be one of their most compelling pieces of evidence: blood spatter analysis. The star witness for this part of the trial was Dwayne Deaver, a forensic expert from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Deaver had been called to testify about the patterns of blood found in the Peterson home, patterns that the prosecution argued told a grim and violent story. Deaver took the stand confidently, explaining in painstaking detail the forensic science behind blood spatter. He showed the jury photos of the crime scene, the blood-streaked staircase, the droplets on the walls, and the pools of blood surrounding Kathleen's body. According to Deaver, these patterns were inconsistent with a simple fall down the stairs. Instead, he claimed the bloodstains indicated that Kathleen had been beaten to death. Using forensic jargon and demonstrations, Deaver outlined his theory: Kathleen had been struck multiple times, and the force of these blows had caused the distinctive cast-off blood patterns seen around the staircase. He pointed to the direction of the spatter, the velocity of the droplets, and their distribution, all of which, in his professional opinion, suggested repeated blows from a weapon, not a single accidental fall. The prosecution zeroed in on this, linking the blood evidence to the missing blow poke they had previously introduced as the suspected murder weapon. For the jury, Deaver's testimony was disturbing. His calm, scientific breakdown of the blood patterns transformed the crime scene from an accident to a deliberate, brutal assault. The prosecution hung their case on this analysis, believing that it gave them the solid, forensic proof they needed to secure a conviction. But the defense was prepared. David Rudolph, Michael Peterson's attorney, wasted no time in trying to dismantle Deaver's credibility. In cross-examination, Rudolph pressed Deaver on the accuracy of bloodstain analysis, emphasizing that it is more art than science, subjective, rather than definitive. He questioned Deaver's methods, asking whether the analysis could be influenced by preconceived notions of guilt. Rudolph argued that Deaver's findings were based on flawed assumptions, designed to fit the prosecution's narrative rather than an unbiased interpretation of the evidence. Years later, in a dramatic twist that would shake the foundation of the case, it was revealed that Deaver had a history of falsifying evidence in other criminal cases. In 2011, a review of Deaver's work uncovered that he had misrepresented his findings in several high-profile cases, leading to his eventual dismissal from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. This revelation cast a long shadow over the Peterson case, raising serious questions about the validity of Deaver's testimony and, by extension, the integrity of the entire investigation. Had the jury been misled by faulty forensic evidence? Could Deaver's analysis have contributed to a wrongful conviction? By the time this information came to light, it was too late to undo the damage in the courtroom. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and the cracks in the prosecution's case had begun to widen. The trial of Michael Peterson had reached its climax. After weeks of emotionally charged testimony, forensic evidence, and the introduction of the blow poke as the supposed murder weapon, the fate of the once prominent novelist now rested in the hands of the jury. The jurors deliberated for days, poring over the conflicting narratives that had been presented. The prosecution, bolstered by Dwayne Deaver's blood spatter analysis, had painted Michael as a man leading a double life, driven to murder by the fear that Kathleen had uncovered his secrets. Their case rested heavily on the forensic evidence, the idea that Kathleen's injuries could not have been caused by a fall, and the suggestion that Michael had beaten her to death with the missing blow poke. The defense, led by David Rudolph, had pushed back against these claims with vigor. They questioned the reliability of Diva's blood spatter analysis, argued that the prosecution's theory was circumstantial, and framed Michael as a victim of a rush to judgment. They reminded the jury that there was no eyewitness to the crime, no definitive murder weapon, and no clear motive beyond Michael's secret affairs. But when the jury returned, their verdict was clear: Michael Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in gasps and sobs as the sentence was handed down. Michael, who had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, sat stoically as the judge announced his sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Kathleen's family, the verdict offered a measure of justice, a validation of their belief that Michael had taken the life of a woman they loved dearly. For Michael's supporters and children, however, it was a devastating blow. They had stood by his side throughout the trial, convinced of his innocence. Now they watched as the man they believed to be wrongly accused was led away in handcuffs to begin his life behind bars. In the years following his conviction, Michael Peterson settled into a new reality: prison life. He was transferred to the Nash Correctional Institution, a medium-security prison in North Carolina, where he spent his days reflecting on the life he had once lived and the legal battle that had taken it all away. The courtroom battles, the media scrutiny, and the life he had built in Durham felt distant now, overshadowed by the harshness of prison life. Even in prison, though, Michael continued to fight for his freedom. His defense team filed appeal after appeal, citing numerous errors during the trial, particularly focusing on the unreliability of Duane Diva's testimony and the blood spatter analysis that had been such a critical part of the prosecution's case. But appeal after appeal was denied, leaving Michael to languish behind bars, holding on to the hope that one day he might be exonerated. As Michael struggled in prison, the public's interest in the case remained strong. Documentaries, news reports, and true crime podcasts continued to analyze every facet of the trial, the forensics, and the family drama that had played out so publicly. It seemed as though the world could not let go of the mystery surrounding Kathleen Peterson's death and the man now sitting in prison for it. But then, years after the trial, cracks began to appear in the case that had sent Michael to prison. Investigations into the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation revealed that Duane Diva, the blood spatter expert whose testimony had been so instrumental in securing Michael's conviction, had a history of falsifying evidence and misleading juries in other cases. The credibility of the forensic analysis in the Peterson trial came into question, and suddenly the conviction that had once seemed so certain began to unravel. In 2011, Diva was fired from the State Bureau of Investigation, and the revelations about his misconduct became a central focus of Michael's legal team. The defense argued that Diva's testimony had been fraudulent, calling into question the integrity of the entire trial. After years of fighting, Michael Peterson was granted a new trial in 2017, and his conviction was vacated. Michael Peterson's years behind bars were long and difficult, but the revelations about Duane Diva's dishonesty and the subsequent legal battles opened the door to his release. It was during this period that new theories like the owl theory began to surface, suggesting that perhaps the truth about Kathleen Peterson's death had not been fully uncovered. The theory came from an unlikely source, a neighbor of the Petersons, who had been following the case closely and believed that the prosecution had missed something crucial. He proposed that Kathleen's death had not been the result of an attack by Michael, but rather a freak accident caused by a wild owl. The theory was, on the surface, strange. How could an owl have caused Kathleen Peterson's death? But as forensic experts and supporters of Michael began examining the evidence with fresh eyes, the owl theory started to gain traction. The theory suggested that Kathleen had been attacked outside by a barred owl, a species known to inhabit the wooded area around the Peterson home. Barred owls are territorial creatures, and they can be aggressive when startled. The theory posited that an owl had swooped down, attacking Kathleen's head with its sharp talons. In a dazed and injured state, she had stumbled inside, disoriented and bleeding, before collapsing at the bottom of the staircase. The multiple lacerations on her scalp, initially believed to be from a blunt object, could have been caused by the owl's talons, and the blood spatter in the stairwell could have resulted from her movements after the attack. What made the theory so compelling were the wounds on Kathleen's head. Experts noted that the lacerations were shaped in a way that could be consistent with talon marks. Additionally, microscopic owl feathers were found clutched in Kathleen's hair, though they were initially overlooked during the investigation. The owl theory, while unconventional, offered an alternate explanation for Kathleen's injuries, one that did not involve Michael at all. Supporters of Peterson seized on the theory, arguing that the prosecution had been too quick to assume foul play and had ignored the possibility of a tragic accident. Although the owl theory was never introduced in court, it became a key talking point for Michael's defense team in the years following his conviction. The theory continues to divide opinions to this day. To some, it is a far-fetched idea, an attempt to explain away a clear case of murder. To others, it offers a plausible explanation that fits the evidence better than the prosecution's narrative. Whether or not the owl theory is true, it added yet another twist to an already convoluted and deeply strange case. Michael Peterson's legal team fought relentlessly to appeal his case, citing the unreliable testimony of Duane Deaver and the potential mishandling of forensic evidence. After numerous appeals and years of legal battles, Peterson was finally offered a deal that would allow him to walk free. In 2017, Michael Peterson entered an Alford plea to the reduced charge of manslaughter. Under an Alford plea, a defendant does not admit guilt but acknowledges that the state has enough evidence to secure a conviction. For Michael, it was the only way to end the nearly 2-decade-long legal nightmare. The plea did not exonerate him, but it allowed him to maintain his innocence while accepting the legal consequences. The emotional toll of the trial, the appeals, and the years spent in prison weighed heavily on Michael and his family. His children, particularly Margaret and Martha Ratliff, whom he had raised after the death of their biological mother, stood by him throughout the ordeal. But the Alford plea, while securing his freedom, did little to answer the questions that still haunted the case. Did Michael Peterson kill Kathleen? Or had she died in a tragic accident, misunderstood and misrepresented by a flawed investigation? As Michael walked out of the courthouse a free man, he did so with the weight of unresolved suspicion still looming over him. He had spent nearly a decade behind bars, and while he was no longer a convicted murderer, the plea left a bitter aftertaste for many. Kathleen's family remained convinced of his guilt, and the Alford plea did little to bring them closure. Michael Peterson had won his freedom, but the cloud of doubt that surrounded his wife's death lingered, casting a shadow over the rest of his life. In the years following his release, Michael Peterson lived quietly, far from the media spotlight that had once consumed his life. But the case itself never faded from public consciousness.